Picture this. Alarms are blaring. Warning lights are flashing red across every control panel, and the reactor core temperature is climbing faster than you can react. You have minutes, maybe seconds, before a catastrophic meltdown becomes inevitable. This isn't science fiction. This is the reality that nuclear operators face when reactor overload begins. And the terrifying truth is that by the time most warning signs appear, you're already running out of time. Today, we're diving deep into the critical protocols and preventive measures that stand between routine reactor operation and complete disaster. Whether you're studying nuclear engineering, fascinated by reactor safety systems, or just want to understand how these massive power sources are kept under control, this video will give you the knowledge that could mean the difference between containment and catastrophe. And trust me, what you're about to learn applies far beyond just nuclear reactors. The principles of recognizing early warning signs, maintaining safety protocols, and preventing cascade failures apply to countless systems in our modern world. Before we jump into the technical details, I want to let you know about two resources that complement today's topic perfectly. First, if you're interested in exploring more survival scenarios and emergency preparedness in a fun graphic novel format, check the link in the description to download our Gamma Roach comic book ebook. It's packed with survival tips wrapped in an entertaining story about navigating post-disaster scenarios. And second, if you want to support the channel and grab some gear inspired by emergency preparedness and the Gamma Roach universe, check out our merch in the description below. Every purchase helps us create more detailed, in-depth content like this. Now, let's get into what you really came here for. How do you prevent reactor overload before it's too late? Before we can prevent something, we need to understand exactly what it is. Reactor overload occurs when the energy being produced inside a nuclear reactor exceeds the capacity of the cooling systems to remove that heat safely. Think of it like this. A reactor is essentially a controlled nuclear chain reaction that produces enormous amounts of heat. This heat is converted into steam, which drives turbines to generate electricity. But if that heat production spirals beyond what the cooling system can handle, temperatures skyrocket and you enter dangerous territory fast. The core of a nuclear reactor contains fuel rods packed with uranium or plutonium. When atoms split during fission, they release neutrons that trigger more atoms to split, creating a chain reaction. Under normal conditions, control rods made of neutron-absorbing materials are inserted or removed to maintain the reaction at exactly the right level. It's a delicate balance. Too little reaction, and you don't generate enough power. Too much, and you risk overload. What makes reactor overload so dangerous is the speed at which things can deteriorate. Modern reactors have multiple redundant safety systems, but if several systems fail simultaneously, or if operator error compounds a mechanical failure, you can go from normal operations to critical emergency in mere minutes. The reactor core can reach temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt through the containment vessel in what's known as a meltdown. Once that happens, radioactive material can be released into the environment, with consequences that last for generations. The absolute first line of defense against reactor overload is relentless, continuous monitoring of core temperature and pressure. You cannot prevent what you cannot see coming, and in reactor operations, every fraction of a degree matters. Modern nuclear facilities are equipped with hundreds of sensors throughout the reactor core and cooling systems. These sensors provide real-time data on temperature, pressure, neutron flux, coolant flow rates, and dozens of other critical parameters. This data feeds into control room displays where operators watch for any deviation from normal operating parameters. Here's what you need to understand. Reactor overload doesn't usually happen instantly. There are almost always warning signs, subtle changes in the data that indicate something is beginning to go wrong. A slight uptick in core temperature, a minor pressure fluctuation in the primary coolant loop, a small change in neutron flux that suggests the control rods aren't responding as expected. These early indicators are your golden opportunity to intervene before a small problem becomes a catastrophic one. The key is establishing clear baseline parameters for normal operation and setting multiple levels of alarms. You don't want just one alarm that goes off when things are already critical. You want a graduated system. Informational alerts when values drift slightly outside normal range. Caution alerts when they move further. Warning alerts when intervention is becoming necessary. And critical alerts when immediate action is required. Operators must be trained to respond to these alerts with practiced precision. When core temperature begins rising unexpectedly, the immediate response is to verify sensor accuracy, check coolant flow rates, confirm control rod positions, and identify the source of the temperature increase. Is it a sensor malfunction or a real problem? Is coolant flow restricted? Are the control rods failing to insert properly? Every second spent diagnosing correctly is a second gained in preventing escalation. If monitoring is your early warning system, then coolant flow is your primary defense mechanism. The cooling system is what keeps reactor temperatures within safe limits, and any compromise to coolant flow is a direct path to overload. Nuclear reactors typically use water as a coolant, though some designs use gas or liquid metal. The coolant circulates through the reactor core, absorbing the tremendous heat generated by fission, and then carries that heat away to heat exchangers, where it's used to produce steam for power generation. This circulation must be constant and uninterrupted. Loss of coolant is one of the most serious events that can occur in a nuclear facility. If coolant flow is reduced or stopped, the reactor core continues producing heat through fission and through decay heat from radioactive materials. But that heat has nowhere to go. Core temperature rises rapidly, and you're on the clock to disaster. Preventing coolant flow problems requires multiple redundant systems. Primary coolant pumps must be maintained meticulously, with backup pumps ready to engage instantly if primary pumps fail. Emergency core cooling systems must be tested regularly to ensure they'll function when needed. These emergency systems can inject massive volumes of coolant into the core if normal cooling is lost. But here's something many people don't realize. Even if you successfully shut down the reactor by inserting all control rods and stopping the fission chain reaction, the core still generates significant heat from radioactive decay. This decayed heat can be as much as 7% of the reactor's full power output immediately after shutdown, and it decreases slowly over hours and days. This means cooling must continue long after the reactor is shut down. The Fukushima disaster in Japan demonstrated exactly what happens when decay heat cannot be removed due to cooling system failure. Operators must constantly verify that coolant pumps are functioning, that coolant levels are appropriate, that there are no leaks in the coolant system, and that backup cooling systems are ready. Any indication of coolant loss, reduced flow, or pump malfunction must trigger immediate investigation and corrective action. Control rods are your throttle and your brake combined into one system. They give you direct control over the nuclear reaction itself, and proper management of control rods is essential to preventing overload. Control rods contain materials like boron, cadmium, or hafnium that absorb neutrons. When you insert control rods deeper into the reactor core, they absorb more neutrons, which slows down or stops the chain reaction. When you withdraw them, the reaction increases. It sounds simple, but the actual management requires extraordinary precision. The position of control rods must be monitored continuously. In many reactor designs, control rods are held above the core by electromagnets and will automatically drop into the core by gravity if power is lost. A fail-safe design called a scram system. But you can't rely only on automatic systems. Operators must actively manage rod positions to maintain the reactor in its optimal state. One critical principle is avoiding power oscillations. If you make large, rapid changes to control rod positions, you can create instabilities in the reaction that cause power output to oscillate unpredictably. These oscillations can stress reactor components and make the reactor harder to control. Smooth, gradual adjustments are the key to stable operation. Another crucial factor is understanding xenon poisoning. After a reactor operates at high power and then reduces power or shuts down, an isotope called xenon-135 builds up in the core. Xenon is an extremely strong neutron absorber, and it temporarily makes the reactor less reactive. If operators don't account for xenon poisoning when restarting or adjusting power, they might withdraw control rods too far, trying to compensate, which can lead to a power surge once the xenon decays away. The Chernobyl disaster was partially caused by operators fighting xenon poisoning while running dangerous tests with safety systems disabled. Preventing overload through control rod management means understanding reactor physics, respecting the limitations of how quickly you can safely change power levels, and never taking shortcuts with reactivity control procedures. Prevention isn't just about what you do in the control room during operation. It's equally about what you do during maintenance periods to ensure every safety system will function when called upon. Nuclear reactors have multiple layers of safety systems, often referred to as defense in depth. You have systems to prevent accidents from happening, systems to detect when something is going wrong, systems to mitigate consequences if an accident occurs, and containment systems to prevent radioactive release even if everything else fails. But every single one of these systems requires regular inspection, testing, and maintenance. Emergency diesel generators that provide backup power if the electrical grid fails must be tested regularly. Batteries that provide power during the seconds it takes for diesels to start up must be maintained. Valves that route emergency coolant must be cycled to ensure they aren't frozen in place. Pressure relief systems must be verified. Containment integrity must be checked for any cracks or weaknesses. Here's where human factors become critical. Maintenance must be thorough, but it must also be scheduled carefully to avoid creating vulnerabilities. You never want to have multiple safety systems offline for maintenance simultaneously. Maintenance procedures must be followed exactly with proper documentation and verification. Shortcuts during maintenance have been the root cause of numerous nuclear incidents. A culture of safety must permeate every level of the organization. Workers must feel empowered to report potential problems without fear of repercussion. Management must prioritize safety over production schedules. Regulators must enforce standards rigorously. When any of these elements break down, the probability of a preventable accident increases dramatically. All the technology in the world won't save you if the humans operating the reactor aren't properly trained and prepared. Preventing reactor overload requires operators who can recognize problems instantly, make correct decisions under pressure, and execute emergency procedures flawlessly. Nuclear reactor operators undergo years of training before they're certified. They learn reactor physics, system operations, emergency procedures, and they spend countless hours in simulators practicing both normal operations and emergency scenarios. These simulators can replicate virtually any malfunction or emergency, allowing operators to experience and respond to dangerous situations in a safe environment. But training isn't a one-time thing. Operators must participate in regular refresher training and drill on emergency procedures constantly. Muscle memory matters. When alarms are blaring and pressure is mounting, you don't have time to look up procedures or think through responses step by step. You need to react immediately and correctly, and that only comes through repeated practice. Emergency procedures must be clear, comprehensive, and readily accessible. They should guide operators through step-by-step responses to every conceivable emergency scenario. Loss of coolant, loss of power, control rod malfunction, containment breach. Operators must know these procedures. Cold communication and teamwork are also crucial. A reactor control room typically has multiple operators, each with specific responsibilities. They must communicate clearly, verify each other's actions, and work together seamlessly. During emergencies, additional personnel, including shift supervisors and emergency response teams, must be notified immediately and must integrate into the response effort smoothly. The human element is both the greatest strength and the greatest weakness in reactor safety. Well-trained, alert, conscientious operators following proper procedures can prevent or mitigate almost any conceivable problem. But fatigued, poorly trained, or complacent operators can turn minor issues into disasters through errors in judgment or failure to follow procedures. Every nuclear reactor is designed with substantial safety margins built into every system and parameter. Understanding and respecting these margins is essential to preventing overload. A safety margin means that the reactor is operated well below the maximum capabilities of its systems. For example, if a fuel assembly can theoretically withstand temperatures up to 3,000 degrees before failing, the reactor is designed so that even during the worst credible accident, fuel temperatures should never exceed half that value. If coolant pumps can deliver a certain maximum flow, the reactor only requires a fraction of that flow for normal cooling. These margins exist because you can never predict every possible combination of events that might occur. They provide buffer space for the unexpected. They account for uncertainties in measurements, variations in material properties, and the compounding effects of multiple minor problems occurring simultaneously. Respecting safety margins means never deliberately operating right at the edge of approved parameters. It means not taking risks to squeeze out slightly more power output or to extend operation when maintenance is due. It means understanding that the margins aren't wasted capacity. They're essential insurance against the unknown. Some of the worst nuclear accidents in history occurred when operators deliberately violated safety margins or disabled safety systems. The Chernobyl operators disabled multiple safety systems and pushed the reactor into an unstable operating regime during their test. At 3 Mile Island, a combination of equipment malfunctions and operator errors led to safety systems being defeated. These weren't situations where the technology failed despite everyone doing everything right. These were situations where safety margins and procedures were not respected. The final and overarching principle in preventing reactor overload is adopting what's called a defensive operations philosophy. This means always assuming that something could go wrong and always being prepared for it. Defensive operations means questioning assumptions. Don't assume that because a system worked yesterday, it will work today. Verify. Don't assume that because one indicator shows normal conditions, everything is fine if another indicator shows something unusual. Investigate discrepancies. It means being conservative in decision-making. If you're not certain whether a situation is safe, assume it isn't until you can prove otherwise. If you're debating whether to continue operation or shut down for further investigation, err on the side of shutting down. There's enormous pressure in any power generation facility to keep operating because shutdowns are expensive. But no amount of money is worth the consequences of a nuclear accident. Defensive operations means maintaining situational awareness at all times. Operators must understand not just what their instruments are telling them, but what is actually happening inside the reactor. They must be able to recognize when instruments might be malfunctioning versus when a real problem is developing. It also means learning from every incident and near miss, both in your own facility and at facilities around the world. The nuclear industry maintains extensive databases of operational events, and facilities regularly review these to identify lessons learned. What went wrong? Why did it go wrong? What prevented it from becoming worse? What changes can we make to prevent similar events? Preventing reactor overload before it's too late isn't about any single system or procedure. It's about layers of protection, each backing up the others. It's about technology working in harmony with trained human operators. It's about a culture that prioritizes safety above all else. Let's recap the critical elements we've covered today. First, you must maintain continuous, vigilant monitoring of all reactor parameters, with graduated alarms that give you early warning of developing problems. Second, you must ensure optimal coolant flow at all times through redundant systems and meticulous maintenance. Third, you must manage control rods with precision and respect for reactor physics. Fourth, you must inspect and maintain every safety system religiously so it will function when needed. Fifth, you must train operators to perfection and drill emergency procedures until they become instinct. Sixth, you must understand and respect the safety margins built into every system. And finally, you must embrace a defensive operations philosophy that assumes something could go wrong and prepares for it. The sobering reality is that reactor overload, if it occurs, happens fast. Once you're in a true emergency situation, your options become limited very quickly. That's why prevention is everything. That's why every procedure, every maintenance task, every training drill, and every safety system matters. Each one is a barrier between routine operations and catastrophe. For those of you fascinated by these kinds of emergency scenarios and survival situations, remember to check out the Gamma Roach comic book ebook linked in the description. It explores disaster preparedness in an engaging visual format that complements the technical information we've covered here. And if you want to support the channel and grab some unique gear, our merch is also linked below. The principles we've discussed today extend far beyond nuclear reactors. They apply to any complex system where failure could have catastrophic consequences. Whether it's chemical plants, aircraft systems, medical equipment, or even financial systems, the same philosophy holds true. Monitor constantly, maintain religiously, train thoroughly, respect margins, and prepare for the worst while working for the best. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay informed, and remember that in any high-stakes system, prevention is always easier than cure. Until next time,